everyone, and welcome to Gaming Mechanics Podcast, where we seek to explore the unexplored topics in games, how they work, and why we love them. My name is Greg. I'm here with Mark, as always.
Hello, everyone.
And this week, we are going to be talking about... We'll have a slightly more discombobulated episode, I believe, today.
Wow. Yeah, build it up, Greg. It's going to be amazing.
Stay tuned! We... doing bad donkey impressions back and forth for a little bit now since we both, which is a very funny YouTube channel. Anyway, okay, so today we're going to be talking about a conversation that came up actually between myself and my roommate Xander, who, if you keep track of the cast, might have heard once or twice. But we were talking about multiplayer, and we talked about this certainly in terms of the big sandbox theme park dynamic. And procedurally generated content, or even just emergent gameplay. But today I was thinking more specifically about the story and the emergence of multiplayer. The question was, in large part, that we came up against, or I was just thinking about and wondering about, was, have we kind of lost... Is current multiplayer, particularly in the context of the Battle Royale, big, giant, 100-person lobbies, have we gotten away from what multiplayer... Why was multiplayer fun in the first place, and what was the goal of multiplayer? What was the point of being able to connect people via games? And just if the question was like, yeah, have we maybe lost sight of that a little bit, and if so, how and why? And there's been a few examples of games that we've been playing, particularly an old whipping dog of ours would be the EA Battlefront remakes. That I've actually been playing due to a weird set of circumstances, and some of the insights that I had from that. I mean, I think we'll just be talking about multiplayer in general, and the ways it's come about and the ways it's changed, and where it's at now.
Yeah, well, it's actually, we played this together. Now, it didn't quite, it didn't make it into the last episode because we also played Subnautica with Xander. And so that sort of eclipsed our discussion about Battlefront. But it was a very interesting experience because we didn't play it in its sort of released vanilla form. Instead, we went ahead and played the version where you play with computers. And I found it much more enjoyable than the other time where I sat down to play it in its normal standard multiplayer deployment, and it was not enjoyable.
Yeah, so fascinatingly enough, we... took all the people out of Battlefront, and actually, talking about Battlefront like 2015, by the way, actually, the original, not even Battlefront 2, the new Battlefront 2, the original, the original remake, EA and DICE version of Battlefront, which was 2015.
Right.
We were playing, and from it, except for yourself and your friend, it's actually really fun. It's maybe not really fun. Still the core gameplay, the gunslinging isn't that great, and there's not too much to do in the game, honestly, but it was loads better, like just miles more fun for me, at least, than I did play a decent amount of that at release back in 2015, with just the full multiplayer. And I remember one of the big, huge selling points of the game was 20 or 40 v. Wait, was it 40 v 40? 20 v 20. I think it's 40-person maps, so 20 v 20 teams, of giant multiplayer Star Wars battle, right? And the big kind of selling point was hopefully given this like sense of scale, I think, like a sense of like really like immersive feeling, like you were really part of the universe and this very alive, counting on to make it feel very alive and not very simulated, making it feel very organic.
Right.
That backfired. And so I do want to differentiate here that I don't think, as Mark and I were discussing this over the past, day, I do think it's multiplayer for the sake, and inclusion of multiplayer for its own sake is not necessarily a bad thing. Also not necessarily a good thing in the way that, kind of like we talked about 3D a while back and the transition from 2D to 3D games, and how new tech kind of became standardized. Games that probably were better in 2D became 3D, and kind of suffered for it for a little while until we kind of came around and realized now these games work better in terms of a 2D playing field, and
right.
And I wonder if multiplayer is in a similar thing in terms of the technological leaps. As soon as we were able to connect everyone. We figured, hey, that's just strictly better than what we used to be able to do. And like I said, I think it is better in a lot of ways. The same way that 3D unlocked so many wonderful things for games. But it's not strictly better. And I think Battlefront 2015 is a great example of a time where it really was not actually what that game needed.
Right.
And
we'll unpack that a little bit when we talk about like what would have been a bit better of a way to augment that experience, and like why is that such a problem in that scenario. But I like what you said that comparing it to 3D, like of course there are good things that came out of the 3D revolution in gaming, but it was hard on some genres, and we did a whole series on that. And so it wasn't a win for everybody across the board. It's not like, oh, we'll just take a game, make it 3D, and it'll be even better.
Right.
Unfortunately, most creative forms of expression don't work that way. You can't just you can't just take the Mona Lisa and like put it on a computer and now it's better. Like it doesn't work that way.
Yeah, music did not become better once we invented like electric music, right? Like it was new, it was different, it pushed the limits of stuff. But music wasn't made. If all music then became electric music, music would be worse, right? Like that's not how that worked.
Right. Yeah, not at all.
One of the good examples of what makes multiplayer. I was trying to think back on some of my the most impressive multiplayer experiences I've had, or the most fun ones I've had. And for some genres, like for me, the RTS genre that's still a single player thing, right? Team RTS games, are fun, but in large part, the competitive scene was only 1v1, and that was a huge deal because you can't have a competitive A in RTSs or anything really, MOBAs, FPSs. For competitive play online, you can only play against humans, and that was fun, and that was its own thing. I also tended to play less multiplayer online because it was too competitive, and I got anxious.
Right? Yeah. Actually, I remember having very similar experiences when playing online felt like a really big deal. Like, I remember getting pretty good at Command and Conquer Generals, which is one of the less played versions of that game, or that series. But I remember playing online and just getting destroyed, and then just being like, okay, I don't think I'm going to do that anymore.
Exactly. Which, that runs into kind of the Battlefield discussion. But anyway, the other one I was thinking about was Journey, right? The borderline, the lowest amount of multiplayer you can have, where you're connected to one other person you can barely communicate with. And it was one of the most incredible, look up, Journey stories and just read about these people that made, some intensely human connections with a person they weren't able to speak to, or, friendships that started that way, which is insane. That's remarkable. And that is, like I said, in terms of that technological advancement level, that is, very low on the scale of, multiplayer networking, right? That's, one person with one person.
Right.
And yet still achieved something spectacular and grand and massive in scope, actually, in a way that these 40v40 or 20v20 matches in Battlefront, which also note we always said this, but even the EA and DICE Battlefronts are gorgeous. They're staggeringly beautiful, both in terms of visuals and the sound. The sound design is just mind-numbingly good. It has everything going for it to be arguably the most immersive Star Wars game that should exist, and yet it absolutely failed in that regard. I think both 1 and 2 did fail in those regards. And there's other reasons for that. There's obviously the monetization stuff and some of the way the gameplay was affected by that. But I think in large part too, just it's just interesting to me that Journey could do that. It could make such a powerful connection with one person, and you could have all the power and money of EA and 40 plus people in a lobby, most beautiful Star Wars rendition that you've ever had, and not have that moment,
Yeah, definitely. Just so in Journey, I would say that connecting with another person is definitely part of the experience, and I think it, even without having to speak with each other, it still comes across, right? You still build those connections with the other person you're playing with. In Battlefront, I would say it's very sort of subordinate to your main goal of winning the battle. Having a conversation is going to be very sort of information tactically driven. It's not going to be about trying to connect with another person on your team. It's going to be about trying to kill those people across the valley, or those people who have you pinned down that are shooting at you. the communication is going to be very information only, I would think.
And I remember feeling, particularly with Battlefront, this isn't just like a reason to be hitting on Battlefront 2015. It's more. I remember, despite the largeness of the player base, it also felt very lonely. Like I felt very isolated through most of the match. It was rare that we'd be grouped up into squads, or people would group up at all, really, if I recall. The maps were gigantic, and traversal was actually kind of difficult, particularly because they changed a lot of stuff about the way you could use vehicles and yada yada yada. But yeah, at the end of the day, it was fascinating in that you have, like you said, that kind of communication that and Journey makes it super easy in terms of it. You don't do anything; a person just appears, and you have one goal with them, and it's very very simple. Very very. There's no tactical information to have to be conveyed, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas Battlefront obviously has all that on top of the fact that you have all of the individual mandates too, like you trying to progress your own character and use different types of weapons to unlock other different types of weapons that may not be entirely conducive to squad based play.
Right, and you're not just with like one other person. If you've got 20 people on your team, you're constantly being mixed in with other people, or like even if you had a buddy for like a second who watched your back and then he dies, and then like he's probably not going to find you again. Like you're just going to continue on with the match, and you're going to play with the other 40 people on the map. And
so I think in large part the EA Battlefront example comes down to me it just seems that, and I'll think of this statement particularly in the context of the current Battle Royale scene. I don't think that game. I think the 40-person multiplayer was primarily a marketing strategy / a goal that was set semi-arbitrarily, probably by executives. That this was just a goal for the game because it sounds awesome and it looks cool. And it was DICE. They'd done Battlefields, which obviously were larger in but that it was more, and that was a big sexy number, and that the game wasn't necessarily designed around that. I doubt that was the kind of core running influential thing that kept all the designers on the same path. I'm guessing the monetization, I'm guessing the progression system were the two things that kept people going in the same place, and everything else kind of came secondary to that. And they're like, oh yeah, we'll also have like 40-player multiplayer in this other system that we built. So hence, it didn't turn out too well, in my opinion. It wasn't part of the DNA of the game, was the fact that you had so many people. And when you begin increasing, this is another conversation that we've had, like, you begin increasing the amount of people and the amount of, human creativity and uniqueness, that inevitably is going to be creating a lot more complexity and a lot more things to be controlling for. And that's really, really hard. It's a lot of effort on developers' fun when you have so many people that could be doing so many different things. And what would usually happen, 2 or 3 people had dominated a lobby of 40 people. And that was kind of everyone else was kind of chump change. So my point is that I'm pretty sure the EA Battlefront didn't succeed in large part because it was trying to do massive multiplayer without having massive multiplayer be the way the game was designed.
Yeah,
and
it was sort of added on. And that's exactly what we're talking about, right? Is like just taking a game that would be good and then throwing more multiplayer at it and saying like that must be even better.
Right. Which, yeah, I don't agree with the PUBG example. That was, what did you say, Mark? You were like, we're talking about an industry that has existed long enough.
Oh yeah, it's existed long enough that the original mod was made. Microsoft hired the person who made the mod to make a version for them. That person did that, but then quit for creative differences and made his own version. Yeah, so it's been around for a while.
So it's been around. The idea of this battle royale, despite the fact that it is semi-new in terms of its popularity, has been being built for a very long time, right? As an idea. But anyway, the point is that has been specifically and 100% vision-based, trying to build a game that would work in this way with this many people. That was the idea from the start. And so yeah, that seemed, and I guess Mark and I have made horrible secret that we're not huge fans of the battle royale genre. as it stands right now. But at the same time, obviously, I'm nowhere near jaded enough to say that it's actually crap.
No.
And these young casuals are like, no, they obviously hit on something incredible and brilliant with PUBG and Fortnite, you know. And I think part of the reason that worked was because it was designed from the ground up to be including that many people. And like I said, just kind of this nebulous DNA thing that I always kind of talk about that we really should specify more on. But I don't really have the technical expertise to do so, is all kind of built into it. And hence it resulted in this kind of combination of vision and execution that turned out to really, really work.
Well, I would say that's mostly true for PUBG, right? So PUBG is obviously the work of a purist, right? Like the person, Brandon Green, who made the mod for Arma 3, who made H1Z1 for Microsoft, wanted to make his own version from the ground up, and it was the work of a purist, and he knew exactly what he wanted to make, and he made PUBG. Fortnite, on the other hand, made something completely different, and then they lucked into a battle royale version.
Yeah, that's we could probably do a whole series on that. Just the stumbling into beating this, because by the current little hypothesis I just threw out that this has something to do with kind of clarity of vision and intentionality. Fortnite's blowing PUBG out of the water now in terms of player base and popularity and just general kind of like cultural zeitgeist. And,
right, but to say that Fortnite didn't learn any lessons from PUBG that it's building on, though, I think would be to terribly misunderstand the state of that game. It very much owes its success to the road that was paved by Brandon Green. And he's probably rolling, not in his grave because he's still alive, but he's rolling over somewhere.
Yeah, really. Good phrase. Oh, he's definitely rolling. I don't know where. I don't know how. Physically. Yeah, no, I mean, you're absolutely right. It's not like it was an entirely different ecosystem that they had never heard of Battle Royale and then accidentally made a battle that was like as good as PUBG in terms of, you know, all of the mechanics and the reason that it was successful. So you're absolutely right that they did take very much from PUBG. And like we said, even just the games before in terms of Arma and like, you know, the Apocalypse and H1Z1, pretty much anything with Z in the title seems to be pretty hot there for us. So, anyway, all right. So that's kind of all I want to say about Battlefront. It was fascinating to me that suddenly other people from it became a lot more fun. Because I think one of the core fantasies in Star Wars isn't survival. Isn't competition. It's fantasy and it's popcorn. You know, it's getting to experience the Star Wars world and the fantasy in a way you'd always kind of wanted to. And when you just get continually murdered by people better than you in Star Wars, it kind of takes you out of, you know, you're not part of this swashbuckling, wonderful saga. You're getting mauled by, you know, like
that one person who was able to become a Jedi or whatever.
Exactly.
Or a Sith, or yeah.
As opposed to G, which makes no claims on, you know, a fantasy of you're just on an island, a nondescript island with nondescript gear in the present day,
fighting to the death.
Exactly.
So that goes back to what we've talked about before when we're talking about like experiences being augmented by having multiple people and by what you're doing. You know, when we start talking about like having PUBG, I think it's interesting that like teams in PUBG, like a majority of people who win PUBG play in teams, and so that is sort of like, okay, you've got multiplayer, but there's almost like another multiplayer layer on top of that, where it's like, okay, everybody's a human, but like also these are your core group of people who like you're trying to play with and win. And so in that way, even though a PUBG match is 100 people, it could be 20 teams of 4 people, or 5 people, I guess. Okay, fine, 25 teams of 4 people. But yeah, because the max is 4. But so that's interesting to me that like even there's something about having such a like dispersed, you know, multiplayer experience where there's, you're not going to communicate with 20 other people. And I don't, frankly, when I hop into a game, want a chat that's connected to 20 other people. Like, that just seems overwhelming. Like, to even try to have a conversation in a channel like that seems like asking for chaos. And that's not how the real military works either. Like, they don't get together as a squad and all talk about what the best idea might be.
Well, yeah, that's not the way the real works when you have more than, like 5 or 6 people doing anything, like sports even, right? Like, I mean, the quarterback's communicating with the coach in football. You don't have every single person weighing in on what they think they should be doing. There's, like, leadership and that's, there's reasons for that. And of course, the military, the one notable exception to this that I came up with was EVE Online, which actually did kind of run into the realm of pseudo-reality in terms of, like, corporations and diplomacy and, like, logisticians and supply lines and timing. War's very boring in EVE. It's actually, if you ever watched a big EVE battle, they're not that... They take hours. I mean, they take, like, 30 hours. Like the big, huge ones. And they're fun to watch because it doesn't look like anything's happening. Kind of like, the real world.
Right.
Anyway, most games, EVE is a fantastic black sheep.
But also, I mean, even in that example, that's because people have created hierarchies in the game that support that level of organization. You could do the same thing in Battlefront, where you have a 20-person like company that's run like a military company, and I think that actually could be kind of fun. But of course, when you're just thrown into a group of 20 random people, that's not going to happen.
Right, and then how do you pick who's who, and how do you maintain any level of discipline, or it's an absolute complete nightmare for also the population of people that are gamers at risk of being a little bit too I mean, I include myself in that population. So this was another interesting thought that I had. Which way do you want to go now, Mark? We could talk about, like, because you were talking about kind of like subgrouping and the idea of having those subgroups, and that can actually work. Obviously, the hierarchical kind of military, more artificial groups are really difficult to make, but that PUBG is a decent example, actually, of within those little 4-person squads that you can suddenly, just what that does and why subgrouping seems to be a good thing for multiplayer, even if it is going to be a big, huge, open one lobby where you have 100 people. I mean, similar to, like, think about raids in World of Warcraft or big MMOs that they tend to break down. You'll be part of, even if you have a big, huge raid group, you'll be part of a smaller group within that, a subgroup, and you'll have little kind of mini commanders and leaders of each individual part of it.
Yeah, I think talking about subgrouping would be interesting. I think one of the primary motivations for subgrouping in games, so by the time your game starts to have internal subgrouping, like where that feels like extremely necessary or something that people are like very eager to do, then your players are telling you something about your game, which is that the individual doesn't feel like they have enough of an impact. So they need to form up with other individuals so they feel like they can actually accomplish something, right? Like if I'm playing PUBG and it doesn't feel like I really can win by myself, I'm going to team up with other people so that we actually have a fighting chance. And if you look at the PUBG leaderboards, that's exactly what's happening. Vast majority of people who have won PUBG and are the most winning, highest win percentages, have played in 4-person groups. And so when you have a game where the individual just doesn't really cut it, of course they're going to find groups to be a part of. And sort of people will self-organize because it's fun to make an impact. It's not that fun to just sort of feel like a nameless person on a battlefield who died a horrible death from a impulse grenade.
Right, within 10 seconds of having, right, and then respawning. No, I totally agree, and I love you'd made a really, really point too about, like, even outside of the fact that that you're probably saying something organizationally about the nature of the game when players are beginning to group up in subgroups, that also gives you another semblance of kind of intrinsic motivation to do that. For players, one is like the social impact. You can actually talk to 4 people. That actually is possible.
Right.
That is fun, and that is something that can happen. As well as you had mentioned, like you can within a subgroup you can make sub goals too. From the overall goal of PUBG being like winning, being the only person alive, but obviously there being multiple steps in that. Being able to take smaller tasks, but still larger than you'd be able to do individually, like, hey, taking this hill or taking this house or garrisoning it. and making that its own thing. So even if you manage to pull that off, right, that feels really good. It's an accomplishment. It was self-set, so it's intrinsic. The game doesn't necessarily reward you outside of, I mean, obviously there's probably resources there. But then you could still die as a whole squad and you still feel like you accomplished something.
Right.
I think that's part of the beauty of the Battle Royale genre is that, yeah, we managed to make a game mode where literally 1 to 4% of the players win, and most people can still have a pretty darn good time with it.
Right. Yeah, and I think there's like a shared sense of accomplishment in that. That's important. Like that's how real like military companies work at like a high level. I've never been part of the military, so I can only speak from limited experience. But people, you have the sense that like there's very much a collective mentality of like we are doing this, and like everybody feels like they belong to the mission of what is happening in a company or a squad. And I didn't get that feeling when I played a game like Battlefront or even when I played PUBG. Well, that's really everybody for themselves, so that's not quite the same thing. But these sort of more massive war games, for some reason when I played World of Warcraft, and there's, I don't know if anybody remembers this, I might be the only one, but Arathi Basin, way back in the day, Vanilla WoW, where it was 15v15.
Legendary place, man. That was some of the very first successful MMO PvP.
Well, I have to say that I really did enjoy that. Now, I felt rather obscure, and that might be kind of why I liked it, was that I didn't feel like I was going to totally let my team down by doing my own thing. But it also felt like I could do my own thing, and it didn't feel like I was going to just immediately die if I strayed off the path.
Yeah. Well, and that's the interesting thing, too, is that, like, there are different levels of... and I'm trying to remember if I said this in the pre-show when we were brainstorming, if I actually said this on air yet. Did I talk about, just the idea of, like, even in MMO between PvP and PvE, right? Like, in PvP, the ideal number of people playing together at that point in time was like 15v15, right?
Right.
So around, as opposed to the biggest raids, the most complex PvE, player versus environment against computer stuff, was capped at 40 players.
Yep.
And over time, that as Blizzard realized their raids aren't. There's a lot better raids and player versus environment tends to be optimized now to 15 to 25.
Right.
Players total against it. And yet PvP is still battlegrounds. There's arenas. There's 5v5, but the battlegrounds are still in that area of the 15v15.
Well, this was
really interesting.
This was part of my point about bringing up the subgrouping discussion, was that people will start to naturally subgroup into sort of little parties of people. When the scale gets big enough, the individual compensates for not being able to make an impact at that scale by forming up with other people. But the dynamics are actually very similar. So instead of having, let's take Overwatch 6v6 in Overwatch games. Instead of having 6 people versus 6 people, you might have 6 teams versus 6 teams, and each one of those teams have 4 people in it. And on paper, it looks like 30v30 people, or let's see, 24 versus 24 people, so 48 people playing in a game. But functionally, there's really 6 teams on each side. And so it's still kind of 6v6. So as a developer, you have to start to think about, like, why am I having this game be at such a scale where people feel like they need to subgroup? Like, why is it not part of my core game experience to have individuals make an impact? Because when you blow up the scale so that it's 40, 50, 100 people on playing a game, and if people feel like they need to subgroup, you're basically pushing them into an experience of, okay, I want you to subgroup with people. And if that's not part of your core game experience, then consider scaling the game down, because it probably can be done with just 10 people, and have everybody feel like, hey, I'm the engineer on this team, and I do all of the engineering stuff, instead of feeling like, yeah, me and 15 other people are the engineers for our corporation, which is what might happen in EVE, for example.
And that's exactly what happened in one part. They just realized you didn't need like 10 healers and like 6 tanks and like 28 DPS, like you could just literally cut and then cut the damage numbers in half, And this is a gross simplification, but in large part it was just scale for scale's sake, and they realized that wasn't healthy for the game, and they changed it, which is, I don't know, that's refreshing in a way that is sad to me. But no, I mean, I totally agree with all the things you're saying in terms of being able to ensure that the core gameplay kind of fantasy of what you're doing is withheld by the skin. In the case of Battlefront, if the fantasy was like feeling like a big part of Battlefront, the gameplay didn't really match up with that. Unfortunately, they didn't build a gameplay loop and a progression system that played into that sort of fantasy. So even within the scope of 40 people, it didn't matter. Of say, like the PvP in WoW, right? The ability to feel like you are working towards a larger battleground kind of objective while still having these tiny skirmishes on the side, which is exactly kind of the idea of the battleground in Arathi Basin.
Mm-hmm.
That worked, and that everything kind of fell into place for that.
Right, and the player pool was like diverse enough that I felt like I was contributing something.
Right.
How many people were there that were my class? Like maybe 3 other people, probably 2, or I may have been the only one. I was a warlock, so those were a little more rare. But I felt like I was somewhat unique in my contributions to the team. Whereas in Battlefront, people are fairly homogenous. I mean, you don't feel like you are like you have a completely different skill or anything. It's like, oh, I have a jetpack, but like I do the same thing as you.
Oh yeah, totally, and that that was another, again, just kind of these other kind of subgroups of that played into why the 40 player didn't really work out with that game, which was that's a great point. I remember I had first gotten it, but literally outside of your star cards, which you get very slowly, which are your abilities, the only customization you have is the type of gun you have. That's it, and most of the guns are pretty similar. Spoiler alert. So, no, really modify that out again, and then add in the fact that there's usually going to be large differentials in skill level because matchmaking's hard, and particularly with 40 people, I don't even know how they began trying to do that, if they even tried to balance that, other than just maybe time played. Then yeah, some very small minority of the player base completely dominating the rest of it in a way that's really not fun and doesn't match up with the reason that people were playing the game in the first place, which was to probably play a big, beautiful Star Wars spectacle. So this brings me to another interesting point. Do you have anything else you want to talk about in terms of that sub-grouping discussion?
No, I don't think so. I think that was my main point, was just if developers find themselves in a position where it feels like people are either going to subgroup or that it's really necessary, they should really take a step back and think about if they need their game to be at that scale. Yeah.
No, absolutely. So one other level of think about is going back to kind of the question of why multiplayer, and to bring this around to current events, or a week ago current events, once again happened, and plenty of announcements this year. Remember, I feel like last year there wasn't. I don't know. There's always a lot of things that happen in E3, but there's not always many important things that happen. I feel like this year.
Last year we talked about how Oblivion was going to start. They're going to start having a third-party mod store, basically. Not Oblivion. Yeah. Wow, Skyrim. I'm wrong entry in the series, but
yeah. Also, email us at greg@gamemechanics.net or mark@gamemechanics.net for where you think the Elder Scrolls 6 will be set. My guess is Seattle, Washington.
Ooh, that's provocative.
Looks like Seattle to me. All right, but anyway, so E3. In so much as there's a lot to talk about with E3, maybe we'll do an E3 episode or something, just like a more roundy up other stuff. But one of the big ones, huge franchises, was of course Fallout 76, in reference to the vault that you'll be coming out of. It'll be a prequel, and will be the first series of the series, or the first game of the series that is entirely multiplayer and online at all times.
Yay!
Right. So this started as a bad move and made a lot of people very unhappy.
Yeah, I'm not actually in support of this, by the way. That was sarcastic. I don't fully understand what they were thinking.
So what? I don't fully understand the thought process here. What is it you say you do here?
Yeah, like, so when Greg was explaining this to me, and I was trying to draw on my past Fallout knowledge, and
Used.
I could kind of see how this might work, right? Like, or at least I could see how somebody might think that it would work. Of like, okay, so people really enjoyed building their own bases in Fallout 4 and kind of having their own area. What if we did that, but like everybody kind of had their own bases together and like they were all on a team building bases?
Would that
I don't I don't know, like that. I think that maybe that was the thought process of like, let's take this thing that everybody loved from the first one, building stuff and setting up like a base area, and let's just make that a game and have the game be like people trying to take land and destroy other people's bases and stuff.
Well, exactly, and it's even marketed as a survival game. That's like the genre that is listed.
Right.
It's like a player online survival game, which sounds oddly close to Battle Royale, not quite, but still some odd similarities. No, I mean, I think, without getting too deep into Fallout, I've actually never played a Fallout game, so please don't kill me or hurt me, or wish poorly on me. I do know a decent amount about it, just being a gamer nerd, and how important the Fallout series is to gamers. And no, I think the idea actually is again, if you had pitched me this game idea without telling me what you or anything about the IP, I'd probably be intrigued. I would not immediately have been by any means.
Me neither.
I wasn't really about 76 either, but that's because I don't play Fallout. I think honestly probably most people would probably be intrigued by something that is far more in the realm of it seems like a combination, something kind of like The Division, almost like an MMO. I feel like MMOs have kind of been branching out into other genres. Like, it used to just be MMORPGs were like what we did.
Oh yeah,
and then like
it was like synonymous.
An MMO shooter, and then Destiny, right, tried a big open world kind of connected FPS, like looter shooters, Sea of Thieves, the exploration stuff has really been branching out. So it seems like this is just another step in that direction, which is the full post-apocalyptic version, I guess, of MMOing. Yeah, you scavenge and you survive and you compete for resources, and that all sounds great. Those are all awesome ideas. Thing is, when you build that on arguably one of the most celebrated single-player franchises ever, like that set the definition of like choice and roleplay and story in single-player games, I can see why people were responding to this less than positively, I suppose. Of course, there's probably a huge amount of fan base that's just being butthurt and just, oh, it's different's bad. But I was similar. You kind of kept on asking me like, so why are they doing this? And I was like, I don't know, dude. Like, I don't. It's unclear to me what they're hoping for. And even just reading, and obviously it's still early. In terms of the release, although the release is November, right?
November, yeah, it's not that early.
Yeah, that's actually not early at all. They're still extremely vague about a lot of the specifics. I'm sure this has been said by all kinds of people who have done analysis, so I'm not trying to claim I'm saying anything new here, but in terms of the question of, like, why multiplayer for this episode is, like, pretty excellent. Like, why were you throwing multiplayer or open world stuff at Fallout? Again, what's the fantasy there? Like, another one that kind of failed, in my opinion, was Destiny felt incredibly empty, and that was a very, very often. It was marketed as this step forward in this combining of genres between MMOs and shooters, and you could drop in at any point, and it was this big, beautiful AAA game, but also you're always connected to everyone. At the end of the day, it kind of did not succeed on most of those fronts. The connection, there's very little interaction you could have, very few ways that you could interact with people once you actually did interact with them. The world seemed to feel empty and kind of sparse as opposed to alive and vibrant, which tends to be the idea of connecting with people. Mm-hmm. Storyline, of course, just got butchered and hurt in a lot of ways, and a lot of development kind of was shoehorned into a very certain way of trying to make the game that didn't quite work. So,
well, and you talked about how they're going to have to do story for this game, right? Like, it's not just that this is how they're choosing to do story. This is how they have to do story. It's all going to be like archival reading, listening to like robotic recordings, and like reading probably old diary entries, and maybe even talking to some modern day robots who've lived through, events that they want to tell you about. But like, it's just going to feel like hearing about a story that's already happened. It's not going to feel like you're participating in anything.
That's precisely what Destiny tried to do. And we've talked about the Destiny kind of story and how I think it's actually brilliant and was communicated very poorly. But no, I mean, it's exactly the same thing where you have, even the way they talked about it made me cringe, like just some of the direct quotes from developers in terms of like the ways that they were like, it really felt like they were like trying to justify something that was not, like, that they weren't even excited about. They're like, no, seriously, we've done this before. Like, you could do this in Fallout 4, too. Like, you could find, like, archival footage. I'm like, yeah, that's true. We also had a full single-player story with other humans you could talk to and, like, a character. No human NPCs in the entire game. So the only humans will be people. So again, it's like, okay, so what are we trying to do? Is it a... And to be fair, it is in between installments, right? Fallout 4 happened. Usually the Fallout series goes a big installment, then like a smaller one that's a little bit quicker, like New Vegas, to the big main installment. So it's not like we're getting like Fallout 5 here.
That's true.
But at the same time, it is a very, very, I don't know, it's fascinating. I'll watch it with great interest. But I think in terms of the question of multiplayer, and if there's any level of shoehorning the Fallout series into multiplayer for the sake of some of these maybe less than positive reasonings that developers might have, that makes me angry and sad on behalf of Fallout fans.
Right. I mean, take a series that has really not been multiplayer, and then like let's make it like massive. I know what our player base wants. They want a multiplayer game. It's like, guys, for the last 15 years, they've been handing you money to make single player games. What makes you think they want a multiplayer game?
I mean, precisely, and you see that all over. Even Elder Scrolls Online, that in large part failed. GTA Online, these massive, beautiful worlds that were beautifully cultivated and are considered some of the best games ever made, but then tried to make the online switch and, had varying degrees of success. None of them I would call major successes. So, anyway, that's just kind of my thoughts on that. That's a pretty on-time example of the whole dynamic with multiplayer. And
to me, the game sort of sounds like almost like Clash of Clans meets like Fallout 4 base building mechanics.
Yeah, kind of. In terms of, I mean, they were even talking about, right? Like, I mean, one of the big huge thing is that you can put a base anywhere, and then you're online, you can attack other people, and you can lose. That's the point. You steal resources. Trying to do that in a competitive game like PUBG makes tons of sense because the match ends and you restart.
Right.
Doing that in a consistent open world thing where you can have, I mean, that reminds me of like the early, like, what's the name for those series? Like the Clash of Clans sort of thing, where like you build up forces and then you like steal from other.
I don't remember. I've played a couple of them and I never really got it. Like it was fun for me to build the base. It was not fun for me to have the base demolished while I was like in the middle of a busy week or something and didn't have time to check on the game.
Totally. No, exactly. So anyway, so that gets down to multiplayer, and this is something that Day 9 talks about a little bit, which is he tends to be taken with very repeatable multiplayer experiences, matches that you can do over and over and over and over. So Hearthstone, Rocket League, StarCraft, games with really tight loops. I mean, Dota, to an extent. That's a little bit longer, but games with really tight games, they're really, really solid, intensive. That can be mastered, and that are ultimately just are repetitive. The goal is to get better at them. That seems to me to work pretty well for multiplayer for that reason, because you don't have to be depending on other people to be for your own move forward. Every time you start a new lobby, you get a new set of people and a new group of people that are working towards the same goal, and it's not competitive in that way. If you're doing something like CS:GO being another great example, right? Like arguably the most important / popular FPS, competitive FPS, certainly of the past, I don't know, 5 years. that is extremely, extremely limited. That was an interesting one that Xander brought up in terms of that was one of the only places where he saw connection happen naturally, even with random people in terms of communicating, which is, I think CSGO's 5v5, right?
Yes, I think so.
Yeah. So again, we're back in that 4 to 6 range, and but that over time, because and he likened it to the permadeath during a round. When you die, you're dead for the round, and then after that, you don't have anything to do. You can't further your own aspirations at all. You can only kind of think about the team and help the team, or pay attention to the way the team still win. Your team can still win even if you die. That, in his experience at least, and obviously, there's toxicity everywhere, but that was the only game that he ever saw that would naturally, kind of organically, made people communicate well as a team, just by playing it. So again, thinking about like that smallness to the multiplayer, where you literally are completely confined within this lobby, and then when you die, you're done. Like, that's it. And that actually seemed to work really well for multiplayer, as opposed to this big, huge open world, consistent, trying to manage the ways that, like everything sticks around, but not really, because you need to have some sort of like reason for wanting to protect your stuff and make it too bad.
Right. Well, talk about like scale. So I've mentioned, primarily when I've spoke about scale so far on this episode, I've talked about scale in terms of the number of people playing. But there's another way you can talk about scale, which is just like the, I guess the persistence of the world, and like how, yeah, I guess so when you have people kind of coming in and out of a world over time, and it's always the same world, it sort of has the effect of playing with more people than you might initially think. Because you're not just playing with the person who, is on right now. You're playing with the person who's going to be on in an hour while you're taking a shower, and the person who's going to be on in 8 hours while you're sleeping. And who knows what they're going to do. And so, again, this scale goes really, increases pretty quickly when you start having a persistent world like that you're only a part of for a very brief period of time, relatively speaking. And so I think that still people will, my prediction for this game will be that if there isn't any sort of teaming mechanic, people will make their own, and people will find a way to form teams, because it's going to be so important to have teammates who help you deal with the scale of what's going on.
Right, which, to be fair, is like, so that's cool. Again, getting back to kind of the fantasy thing, talk about like post-apocalyptic survival, right? That's the ideas, that's what we see in most post-apocalyptic fiction, is like people turning back into kind of a tribal society, own groups, and becoming, kind of devolving a little bit in terms of societally. But that's exactly the fantasy of the post-apocalyptic thing, survival. So maybe that works, and maybe that's awesome. It sucks for Fallout fans, more so that I think, in fact, people like you or I, Mark, who don't have a whole lot of emotional attachment to Fallout.
Right. It's enjoyable to watch as just like a gaming experiment for me.
Right, but if this was like something like, it was basically when the whole Command and Conquer 4 can of worms, but when they completely switched the genre series and then tried to wrap up the whole series with that game, I flipped shit because it was horrible.
Right.
And people who didn't care about RTSs or Command and Conquer didn't care too much that Command and Conquer 4 sucked, right?
Right.
It's fun. So, but that being said, Fallout is, that's it's fire, man. There's either a significant amount of courage or just blind stupidity that went into some, what do people like? What's our core player base? Like, probably competitive
yeah.
To ruin other people's days
by nuking them. Yeah, apparently that's true. And maybe, I don't know, there's the Fallout 4 mod right now that is adding griefing options and nuke. So maybe we'll see a sign of what's to come with 76. But I also will say, man, the 76 date being November is a real quick turnaround for a game of that size, at least, or of an IP like that. Yeah, that is pretty surprising.
But in any case, I think at the end of the day, the why multiplayer thing is very much a question of if it serves the. I feel like we come to many of the same conclusions, which I guess is a good thing. But no, I mean, if multiplayer is going to serve the experience of the game that you're looking for, and the fantasy that you're trying to sell, then that is not inherently a bad thing by any means. In fact, we've been talking about, some of our favorite multiplayer experiences have been really deeply powerful, and there's a reason that people crave that sort of thing. So that is not a bad thing by itself. It's more, again, this kind of troubling trend of buzzwords or more is better mentality that I really don't like to see becoming rampant in the game industry.
Well, and to go back to Fallout for just a quick second, like, it could work really well where it becomes exactly the fantasy that they are hoping unfolds from this game, right? Like, where it's factioned, because Fallout 4, or all the Fallouts have always been about factions of humans, interacting in this post-apocalyptic world. Obviously, this won't be post-apocalyptic; it will be apocalyptic. But
it'll be kind of. I mean, it's both.
It'll be, well, it's supposed to be the sort of apocalypse, right? It's like this is the factioning and battle that kicked off the Fallout world, and it's chaotic and crazy, and like it could unfold that way. Or if it's too hard to sort of conglomerate and factionize and group together, people just might not play it. In which case, nothing will happen in the game.
Or if, exactly. Then in which case you'll have a bunch of curious people play 20 hours and then.
Right. Like there has to be a critical mass for something like this in order for. So that's a risk, and I guess that's a good, like, hats off to them for risking. I don't know. Risk on its own is it's not a valiant thing. But it's
hats off to the guy off Niagara Falls.
Yeah, exactly. But it might work. This is kind of what I'm stumbling through. It might work because they do have a lot of people who are invested in the Fallout series, and if they can get critical mass of people playing this game and factioning and subgrouping, that might succeed in accomplishing the experience that they hope it gives. But
don't know if they, as Bethesda as a studio, has the capabilities to pull off a game like that. They're good at single player games.
Yeah, that's a good point. Okay, well, I think since we've been talking about multiplayer, and I think I'm going to take a second to talk about people being unfriendly in games and what happens when you have one big goal that everybody's working toward. That's like the advertised, almost the only goal in the game, and it feels like other people are getting in the way of that goal, and you as an individual player have virtually no ability to set a sub-goal within the game.
That's good.
I think that becomes incredibly frustrating. Obviously, people can, the way that they think about the game could be shifted so that you think, well, if I'm a really good mercy and I heal everybody on my team, that's the best that I can do, and if my team still loses, I can still be satisfied with that. I think if games could help people to do that by establishing sub-goals that they could accomplish, that would be better. And I think people would be less bitter at each other for getting in the way, quote-unquote, of accomplishing the one big goal that their team has, if they could at least feel like they were accomplishing something.
Right, which I think is, Overwatch does try to do that, using the Overwatch example in terms of giving, breaking down kind of damage taken, like, by different roles, right? So even just the physical aspect of getting shiny medals that look really nice at the end of the match, even if you've lost the match. It doesn't really linger to your defeat animations.
Yeah, that's true.
It doesn't really emphasize who won the match as much as your individual performance afterwards. But at the same time, I mean, I was thinking about that as you were talking, and sub goals can be reduced to something that really sucks too, right? Like, fine, I'm just gonna if sub in such a way that can be achieving aren't fun, then that's useless. Even if you are technically achieving these sub goals, like, okay, fine, but the best I seem to be able to kill per life in Battlefront. that, like, and that's my sub goal for the match. And if I do that, then am I satisfied at the end of the match? It's like, well, technically, like, I succeeded at that thing, and so there's a small intrinsic level there, but the force of the extrinsic devaluation of what would probably overwhelm that, right? So there are limits. Idea of like subgroup yourself, in so much as do anything in a game. Of course, you can always do that, but you can't use that as a exception, or rather, for like good combination of the extrinsic and intrinsic kind of motivators.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. It's sort of like the, winning the battle but losing the war thing. It's like, the sub goals are only so good because the reason that the sub goals are important is that they support the overarching goal. And if you failed at that, then it's hard to feel good about the sub goals. And I get that.
That, like, even if you don't feel like you were able to be the person who was where you got, like, 14 kills and we won by 13, then, like, being able to have done something that was able to support that person in getting those kills would feel a lot better than having done something that you, like, technically succeeded at, but didn't necessarily support the overall effort. So maybe that kind of, like, subgrouping of goals is really important, in the way that you connect what their sub goals would be. So that'd be an interesting fast, even just talking about, like, the way the games, because right, like, when you enter a multiplayer lobby for Battlefront, there's no way you can, like, win the match immediately. There's all these tiny sub goals you have to do in this list of stuff you have to take. For the Walker Assault mode, for example, right? There's all kinds of things you have to do, and each one of them, in theory, would be able to be building on each other, kind of complete this overall goal. But as I said before, Battlefront didn't quite seem to hit that line where it was actually giving you a sense of feeling like you were really changing the way the game went, unless you're one of the top 3, kind of players, and the lobby of 40. That could be an interesting thing to look at.
Well, think about this. Like, this is an idea that just popped into my head. What if a game like Battlefront, like, told you as a player, like, hey, so-and-so's doing really well. Consider, like, supporting them. And then, like, showed you where they were on your map or something. So that you had the option of, like, going and supporting the person who's, really helping your team. Or a group of people that are really helping your team. Because it seems like then it feels like, okay, at least I have a hand in supporting this team that's making an impact, even if I feel like I'm not sure what to do here. And I think it could, obviously there's people who are going to come to the game and be like, yeah, whatever, that person's still not doing it right, I'm going to go do my own thing. And that's fine, you can let them do that. But for people who are new and, like, want some direction in a game that's like 20 people running around with guns, it would help them to have some direction of, like, oh, this person is, like, on the front and they're getting a lot of kills and they're really helping us. I'm going to go be with them for a bit and, like, see how it, and I don't know, maybe it wouldn't work because people would swarm the best person or whatever, but it's an idea of, like, this is a way that you could get people to try and work together and direct them toward one another so that they could, be on a team instead of just kind of frantic and disorganized.
Yeah, no, I love that. I mean, that's just like having Clippy for, like, you look like you're trying to, like, support a teammate.
Yes, less obnoxious though, hopefully.
Well, and as a final note, in my effort to try to be as fair as possible, I do remember Battlefront would assign you a random, when you spawned in, you'd be assigned a partner, basically, that meant nothing other than the fact that you could always see them on your map. 1, 2, you could spawn in on them, actually. So if you died and your partner was still around, you could spawn right on top of your partner and be back with them, and vice versa. So that was, I think, one tiny. Also, in the interest of being fair, too little too late, and not enough to overcome a lot of its other issues. But no, I think that idea is excellent, in terms of, particularly for a big, huge 40-player thing, right? Being able to give some direction, being able to play basically the coordinator, having the game play the coordinator instead of trying to find a person to do that, because that's so hard. People don't respond to that. But if the game has kind of an AI part of it that's able to kind of direct a little bit the overall big stuff, then that could be, I think if utilized well.
Yeah, I think it could be really interesting. Like, those matches are too short-lived and too chaotic for human hierarchy to sort of emerge organically. Like, in the EVE example, things are not it's not very chaotic and it's extremely long-lived. And so the natural human tendency to create hierarchies and to organize is allowed to express itself. But in a very short-lived game lobby, like in Battlefront, that's just not going to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. Much less with even the tools you have, right?
Right.
That's cool. I like that thought a lot. I have to think about that more, too.
All right, well, maybe that's a good place for us to end here, then. If you guys have your own thoughts on multiplayer, Fallout 76, Battlefront 2015 or 2017, give us a message by emailing mark@gamingmechanics.net or greg@gamingmechanics.net. And we are still raising money for a PlayStation 4. If you'd like to check that out, we are on Patreon at patreon.com/gamingmechanics. If you want to throw a couple bucks our way, that would be amazing. And we will see you guys next week.
Awesome. Have a good one.
If you enjoyed this episode of Gaming Mechanics, check out our Twitter at Gaming Mechanics or our Facebook by going to facebook.com/gamingmechanics. Thanks for listening.